Steven, it's an honour to have you here.
Thank you.
You are the director of the recent film adaptation of Kent Nerburn's novel, Neither Wolf Nor Dog, which is a kind of classic modern-day American story about the Native American culture and some of the things that have happened to the First Nations people there. Can you tell us a little bit about how you kind of came into working on this project?
Well, it was a funny thing. I had been filming on Pine Ridge for quite a period before that. I'd done a movie called Resbom in particular and been filming a documentary that I'd been working on for a long period. And I was doing a series of screenings around the reservation of Resbom, and I did one in a theatre in a border town called Rushville. And Kent was in the area at the time working on a project, and he just so happened to be in that town that night and came along to the screening. And thought, well, you know, here's somebody who has succeeded in filming in the area and getting, you know, the vibe and the tone and everything, you know, right. And he'd had people in Hollywood around the project for a long time trying to get it made and failing, and a lot of false promises and a lot of stupid, you know, Hollywood spins on the story that he just groaned at because they were, you know, very non-authentic. And he gave me the novel, and it took me a while to get around to reading it. And then when I did, there were certain things that just really resonated with me, and then but I still sat on it for a while thinking about it because I didn't want to commit to anything that I didn't feel sure I would bring across the line. And then I was in Cambodia traveling and editing my Pine Ridge documentary, and I got in touch with him and he sent me the script that he'd worked on up to that point. And I said, okay, let's give this a go, and took a pass on the script, rewrote it, and we passed it back and forth between us. I mean, the majority of the writing is his, but I was reshaping it and adding in a few things and, you know, making it structurally more like a movie. And one of the key things was I cut a lot of scenes and sent it back, and he was very happy about it. Not often a writer's happy about scenes being cut, but it was because I cut a lot of the false notes that the Hollywood people had been asked to be put in, that he just felt were really not authentic and whatever else. So he was very happy that I picked all of those moments up and, you know, slapped them on the floor. And
so you developed a really good rapport with him pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that our greatest strength together was that, and this goes all the way through to the end result, we are more concerned about getting the tone right than either of our egos relating to the project. I'm not saying that neither of us have egos and you know, different personalities and whatever else, because, you know, when you have to be a bit maniacal to make a film the way that I do. But for us, there was always that absolute truth of the project having elements that were a lot bigger than us. So we never had conflict on that side. I mean, if we saw things from a slightly different angle, it was more a case of searching for the depths of reference within it. You know, for example, there was something in it that he'd experienced that I hadn't through other people of, you know, tension in sort of the Standing Rock area regarding relatives of Sitting Bull versus relatives of the tribal police that killed Sitting Bull. But a few months later, while developing the project, I bumped into somebody who was from one of those sides of the equation and had the direct experience of what was in the script. And so for me, that type of thing is hugely important for me. I wanted to, you know, be absolutely sure of the validity of anything that was in it, even if it's a tiny little character piece, like, you know, the foreign accent in the border town museum was exactly what the person who showed us around that very museum a few weeks earlier had. And it's an unusual texture. It's not what most people would have done, but having known that it was real gives you strength to do that.
So there's this kind of almost element of authenticity behind the film, which you've tried really hard to maintain. And I noticed in reading the book that there is this almost element of authenticity that's running through it. There should be nothing that's over glamorized or the likes. And that's what can you tell us a bit about?
Well, in a sense, that's touched upon in the narrative in itself. I mean, Grover challenges Nerburn in terms of it not being your standard outside looking in take on Indian country, which becomes a very singular vision and very often very sanitized or glorified, even if it's just that sort of wise elder kind of image. And the fact, like anyone in life, everyone is multidimensional, and that was, that level of multidimensionality was key. And so for me, I mean, the biggest decision in the entire film was who was Dan, because it was an incredibly hard character to cast, and there was only a handful of native actors old enough and with experience to play such a role, and none of them embodied what the character had. The key about it is, in the novel, the character is about 78, 80. But the book was written about 20 years ago, and it's sort of one of these guys who were brought up by people who were born free. And so 20 years on, casting someone in their late 70s would not work, because they had a contemporary vibe about them, and you can't really act your way out of that. And so for me, we had to go with somebody a lot older, and Dave was 95 when we filmed, and so really was of that generation. Was born in his grandfather's teepee in the late 19-teens, and was surrounded by people who grew up before the reservation system ever started, and they embody something completely different, and that was the key. And literally no one else could have played that role but Dave Baldeagle. I mean, I looked, and it was a big challenge, in the sense that no one in Hollywood would finance you with that sort of risk, even just in terms of the age of anyone playing it, in terms of insurance. But there was no point in making the film any other way.
So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to choose the rest of the cast?
Well, it was interesting because, with some of them, I mean, the first person who's in the film that I actually auditioned was Roseanne Supernault, and I had been up in Canada searching actors up there about 3 years before we started filming, and I was principally looking still for Dan's at that point. I hadn't found Dave yet, but her agent insisted I'd see her, that she was just so amazing and whatever else. So I brought her in and auditioned her for both the granddaughters, and she was terrific, really terrific. And then when we neared filming, I had a lot of other actresses audition for the role, and nobody felt right for either of the granddaughters. And so I floated the idea to Kent about why not have them both as twins, and even accentuating the different roads that they took more so. And he actually really loved the idea. I mean, he was terrific that way, in terms of seeing the potential in something rather than being set in their ways about something, how something had always been. Her partner Delvin, I'd always had Tatanka Means in mind, but as we neared the production, I was concentrating on other things at that point, still hadn't given him a shout over it. And then Tatanka, who I've been very fortunate to know for a number of years, got in touch and said, congratulations on, setting up this film. Any role for me, just let me know. I'd love to be a part of it. And it was so touching. And I said, well, actually, you were my dream choice for this role. And so he was on board. Zahn McClarnon, I just think is one of the finest actors I know. And he was helping in, try to get the project out there, see if we could help bring in some money and things like that. And so he was always on board for whatever role fit him. And having someone of his chops play the character Billy, who comes into the cafe and has a drink problem, I needed somebody with the quality to really bring out the humanity in that character and it never fall into stereotype. And Zahn actually helped me with the audition that I did with Chris Sweeney. I funnily enough met and saw in a play at the Native Voices program, so a native play, and he was sort of the token white guy. And as coincidence happens, I mean, he's no involvement with Indian country in general, but happened to have been born on an Indian Health Service hospital on the Yakima Reservation up in Washington State. Just one of these little coincidences. And there was something about him that just intrigued me, and so we brought him in and had him read, and just from then on he was the only person I had in mind, and literally the only person I auditioned in that role, and I could have auditioned a lot of people for that role. And it was a great call. He just played it immaculately for me. And I initially had someone else in mind for Grover, and as we neared the production, I started to see work that Richard was in and really loved what he did. There was something very unique about him on screen, a lot of depth and humanity, but just so watchable. And the person that I'd already talked to about the role anyway wasn't going to be available through that period that we needed to film. And it was sort of one of those things that you just have to, you know, the universe is a funny thing. It sort of directs you often to where things are meant to be. And, you know, it had to be Richard. And he's so perfect in the role. But not just that, he understood the weight of the work, and his level of commitment was extraordinary to the project, and gave me such strength because, you know, some people could give you a hard time on a lot of material, especially when it's something that, you know, it's cultural to them and has been their entire life, and, you know, I'm coming in and helping represent that, and all I got was support. And the key thing was with some of the key moments, like in the climax, there were certain things in the novel and in the script that I was pretty sure we wouldn't film because it was inappropriate. There was some cultural things like a pipe ceremony, which I didn't want to film because I knew you just shouldn't record those things. And so I sat down with Dave and worked out how to do that, how to, instead of that, how we would go into these scenes. And also, you know, sometimes when you're filming and you're working with material, and hopefully sometimes when it's in a more linear fashion, for example, the Wounded Knee climax we shot at the end, and by that time we really figured out that the journey that we'd made through the filming was taking us in a slightly different direction to what was in the script and the novel, which was a bit more about Kent. And it was a bit more about how the process of being there impacted him and certain visions that he was having while sort of sleeping there and almost hallucinating at the monument. And it was just clear while filming that that was too gimmicky and too much of a device to do on film, because the filming style had to be so grassroots, so authentic. That to go in that direction, I think, would have snapped the audience away from where we were at, and we had to take it into this purely raw place. And so we handed that over to Dave because Kent and I could never write what Dave could share with us about Wounded Knee, and that was the key with the film, was knowing what the right notes were at the right period, the right approach, the right camera style. Very often it was very set back, letting everything play in very, very long takes, and the actors doing their magic. And then there were other scenes that, in complete contrast with that, I had to really make intense. Scene in Sheep Mountain where they're in the car talking about a lot of the historical trauma and the killing and whatever else. And all it is 3 close-ups of our 3 guys' faces, never sharing the frame, and it's very intense and very deeply personal, and it's made all the more so because so much of the rest of the film is filmed set back. If it was all shot sort of like TV, somewhat in close-ups and whatever else, you would never get that sense of contrast. Same with the camera being set down most of the time, and then sometimes snapping to Steadicam scenes where there were either more volatile things going on or more uncertain, and just using the cinematography to accentuate that. So,
I mean, there's a real feeling of sort of slowness to it, and you've deliberately made a lot of scenes quite long in some regards. So, as you said, you're placing the camera in a space and observing something. Can you tell us a bit about why you chose to do that?
Well, the thing about it is, I think that, you know, a big part of the story is understanding their energy, their positions, their, it's Dan's space. It's about Kent coming into Dan's space. And, an elder like that exists in the time around them and the environment and the space. So for me to use the language of cinema of a more contemporary, faster paced language would have not put us in the right space. And it's sort of one of those things where you have to make a bold choice to say, I might lose some of the audience over this because they want to be force fed. But Dan wouldn't force feed you. You have to pay attention and you have to listen. And the same with a lot of details. Dan will show you Kent something and whatever else. And I want us to absorb how Kent is responding, how Nerburn is responding to that, rather than, ooh, this is the close-up, this is the this is the that, because that's not important to me. It's how it's impacting the characters.
Can you also tell us a bit about some of the sites that you chose in the reservation and why you chose them?
Well, I mean, a lot of the time, it was a combination of things. I mean, I'd scouted extensively throughout the whole region of the story, and there's so many breathtaking locations up in North Dakota, South Dakota, and whatnot. But the reality in filming, especially when you're filming so fast and also with an elder, we had to be very aware of time. And so, for us to go driving 4 hours to another location or doing a whole location shift would have just been too draining on all the resources. So we filmed mostly on the northern part of Pine Ridge Indian Reservation because it provided a lot of the key things we needed. We needed access to Wounded Knee for the climax. We needed the Badlands. But also there were a lot of still vast plains that we could film in. And, access to an airport. I mean, it's a lot of these logistical things really come into it. And I knew the reservation very well, having spent, it's now about 17 years I've been going out there. So a lot of back roads that I knew very well and had some of my favorite spots on. So, for example, this ruined church there, I first visited there maybe 15 years ago, and I just loved that spot. And so it gave me that shorthand of getting in. But sometimes, a lot of time, it was just very practical. There was one cafe that was within distance that was practical to us. And so, and afterwards in post-production, I would, computer regenerate some of the signposts and things like that to indicate at least it was in a different part of the state. But all movies are that sort of filled with those sort of cheats, really. And it's one of those things. It's very nice that people talk about the beautiful cinematography in the film and the nice look that it's got. I'd like to take a lot of credit for that, but it's not really appropriate because all you have to do in those locations is just point the camera, and it's so beautiful anyway. And it's hard to shoot Dave Bald Eagle's face and it not look spectacular because he has such a beautiful face. And all the characters. Richard is a joy to film as well. So, it was very easy that way.
How long was the actual filming? How long was the process?
Well, we shot for...
Time frame.
Yeah, there was 16 days that we had with Dave, Richard, and Chris. And then we had a couple more days with Chris on the reservation. Mostly small incidental things. And then I picked up a few shots as well at the end. And then Chris and I did sort of 3 half days in and around LA afterwards, just for his backstory, where his family, things like that. We sort of cheated those locations, and we found a motel in the hills there that we managed to make sort of look more Midwesterny. And so it was very fast. And normally 18 days is very fast to shoot a film, but in those cases, normally 16 hours a day. And we were on average probably filming 6 to 8 hours a day. So it was, even then, a tiny amount of time. And it's quite a long film to film in that amount of time. And some days we shot very little because maybe the Buick would break down and we'd be fixing it. And but then we had some monster days of doing a huge amount. The films, the days set around Dave's house, Dan's house, we filmed a huge amount very, very quickly because, it was just nicely contained. And things like that location, we found that, I think, a day before or 2 days before filming. And it was where, the place where we had as a base, you know, they had a mechanic who would come in and do work for them. And he helped us out on some mechanical things as well. And it turned out this was where he was living, and it was just perfect. So we had very good fortune that way. There was a lot of things that we were very lucky with. And the casting is central to it. I mean, we had no right to ever expect to find a perfect Jumbo. And Jumbo is a key character in the novel, and particularly the 2 subsequent novels. He's a much bigger character in them. And, you know, central to it is his size. But like any character, the performance is the essence. And so this guy Yellow Pony, who actually is in the film, he plays the kid with the basketball at the beginning. So he lined me up with 3 guys to audition, and all were terrific. They were all the right sort of size. The characters described as over 400 pounds. All were mechanics, fabulously enough. And they all did a great job. But Harlan, there was just something so perfect about what he did. And he needed no direction on screen. What I really liked was there was a couple of lines that felt a little clunky to him on the page, and you know, so he pitched up about it, and he was totally right. And you know, I liked the fact that he came on and immediately fell into being a collaborator in amongst people who had been on movies a long time. And I mean, I was just so impressed with that, because it would, you know, be easy for someone who's never been on screen before to be self-conscious and you know, nervous. And he just owned the space. And with Yellow Pony, with the basketball role, we had someone lined up to be in the scene. The scene was written that it took place inside the trading post, and there was this girl behind the counter. And there's a conversation goes on there, and then there's this other guy with a basketball wandering around, and he connects with Kent. But we had the girl lined up, and she flaked out on us within hours before filming. So even though I had it lined up with the trading post to film inside, we just ended up closing the door, putting a signpost out that it had closed, and then doing a scene out back in a basketball hoop. And actually I prefer it. It's one of those happy little accidents where you don't freak out and you don't whatever, you just think, oh, how can we change this and maybe make it better? Annie, who plays, Dawn Little Sky, who plays Annie, lived maybe 25 minutes away from our base, and her husband was Eddie Little Sky, who was a famous native actor back going to the John Wayne days. His 60s really was his heyday, so she lived in Hollywood for a long time and had been in movies back then. So, you know, the cast, it was one of those happy little miracles. I mean, I had no right to expect anything so fortunate. And also, I mean, within that, I mean, filming so quickly, to have so many scenes that are a wide single take, like with Yellow Pony, the basketball hoops, I think we shot 2 takes, maybe 3 takes, and it's all in a single shot. And so they had to be perfect. And they were. And similarly with, you know, Roseanne had about a 4.5 minute single take on screen. And she's just astonishing through it. And that was, you know, one of 2 takes. There was a wider take and then a closer take, and then we moved on because we didn't have time for anything else. And I can tell you, I've worked with very, very, very few actors in my career with whom you could guarantee that. Very few.
Now, yeah, you were talking a bit about kind of Dave and some of the other actors there who've obviously kind of worked before in film. Can you tell us a bit about some of their previous works?
Well, Dave had been in and around it when he was a young man, and he'd, you know, talk about being on screen with Marilyn Monroe and going dancing with her after one of the shoots. I think he was a stuntman of some form on an Errol Flynn movie. And so he'd been in and around things back then, and then even more recent years, he had actually been on screen with Zahn in Into the West, which was a very big production. I think he played Zahn's father or grandfather in that. And so it was nice when Zahn was on set. It was touching seeing them reunited. And Zahn is unbelievably busy. He's the busiest actor I know. He's just in one TV show after another. Fargo, the second series of that being one of his most prominent, which I can't think of anyone I know who deserves it more. He just works so hard, and Zahn, Tatanka is doing exceptionally well right now as well, so which is wonderful. It's well deserved.
I've seen Richard around in a few films.
Yeah, I mean Richard. I first saw him in Barking Water, which was a Sterling Harjo movie, and he was one of the 2 stars in it. It premiered at Sundance about 5-6 years ago. Went to Venice Film Festival as well, and I think the thing about it was that there's not a lot of native roles on screen, and very often when they're done in Hollywood terms, they fall into quite one-dimensional characters. Now Sterling is one of the most established native filmmakers, and that's the last thing you'd ever see in one of his films. And so, Richard had a really great opportunity to create a beautifully distinct human being, and it's tragic how that's denied native actors. It's obscene when you think about it. My friend Russell Means used to talk about being on film sets, and directors would discuss with the white actors the characters and whatever else, and then he'd go over to the Indians and tell them how they were going to be. And it's not a wise thing to have done around Russell, because he would have kicked up a hell of a stink about it. But and so, for me, it's so rewarding seeing these great talents going out and creating these wonderful roles. I mean, I even had a very well-established native actor who I was talking to a while before, asking about anyone who might have been a Dan before I met Dave. And he threw out a name and then followed with, yeah, but you just need an old guy. And I said, well, no. This is such a distinct character. You cannot just fall into that formulaic casting. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous for any character. And I think the problem is that it's been so the way casting natives over these years that it just becomes a default thing, and it should be challenged at every moment.
Speaking of kind of the obviously choosing Dave Bald Eagle for the part of Dan, I was reading somewhere that Kent had an experience which is very similar to this. I think from what I remember reading, there were several elders all who approached him.
From what I gather from Kent, there was a principal Dan, and then there were a couple of others who were similar elders with whom he had. I mean, the novel is famous for a lot of the monologues out of Dan with his worldview, and they were things that, I mean, basically Kent had gone through, had experienced. A lot of the characters in the film are drawn from people he knew, or composites of people that he knew. And a lot of the dialogues of Dan were shared with him, and he'd already done a book with youth on the Red Lake Reservation, this referenced in the movie, about translating stories. And so this novel became a different kind of vehicle to translate those stories, and the conversations they'd given Kent, he then transposed into Dan on the page. And I remember when Josie, Dave's wife, was reading it, she just kept giggling and saying, "This is Dad," as she calls Dave. She just said, "This is," he says this all the time.
Excellent. Was Josie there on site?
She was there for most of the time. And then there was a wonderful moment. On the third day's film, the first 2 days were very light because I wanted to introduce the characters, the actors, the characters quite lightly. So we did some of the lighter scenes when they're driving back to the reservation later on in the film, and a dialogue between Grover and Nerburn. And then the third day was our first full-on day, and it had quite a few big scenes and a lot of travel to the locations that I wanted. And we went down to, and it was taking a little bit of time for some of the scenes to settle, particularly when Dave had dialogue because of his age. And then the third day we went to Wounded Knee, and Dave did a ceremony at the beginning, a prayer. It was very deeply moving, particularly for those that hadn't been there and gone through it, like Chris hadn't. I mean, I've had the good fortune of being at Wounded Knee many times and for many occasions. And it was very interesting because after that, Dave just nailed everything that day. And any time we filmed anywhere near Wounded Knee, it was like he became almost superhuman within what he could achieve, energy-wise and focus-wise. And but there was a scene at the end of that day that we were filming in this border town, which is about 80 miles away from our base. And it's actually the same border town where I met Kent for the first time, because there was this beautiful little museum there. And I needed a old person to be the volunteer looking after the museum. And this guy who'd shown us the museum weeks before was Danish. He was about 90 years old and still had quite a strong Danish accent. And I'd been trying to find an actress or actor from the region and couldn't find anyone. And I'm juggling so many things, I can't concentrate on it. I'm thinking, where am I going to find somebody? And it suddenly dawned on me that Dave's wife, Josie, she was an actress in Belgium when they met. And so I just suddenly asked her, and she said, of course, I'd love to do whatever, yes. And so she was in that scene, and it's just so wonderful seeing Dave and Josie together. And the film has been such a satisfying thing for Dave. I remember when we screened it for him as a preview early on in South Dakota, and you were there, and him saying it was the first time he'd ever been on screen or in a film that told the truth about his people. And you know, for all the beautiful things people are saying about the film, I don't think there's ever anything that would ever be more I would be more happy to hear than that.
That's quite a powerful...
Yeah, and from somebody who I love as much as Dave and respect. And but at the same time, I mean, when we were in every part of the script, you know, Dave would never, and Richard would never have said anything they did not feel comfortable saying. And we worked through some things, particularly relating to the Wounded Knee climax and whatever else, to make sure that we weren't missing any opportunities. And so their sense of ownership of it is really strong, which is really perfect.
Yeah, they carried it off really well.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of real integrity amongst all of them, even meeting them off set.
Yeah.
I think that there is this element where they are looking for a kind of, is it to put to bed something that had obviously happened to them and their kind of nation.
And I think it's also putting to bed something in cinematic terms, because the depiction of Indian country has been so dire. And, you know, in a sense, I think a lot of the cinema should not be as culturally specific, because it should be entertainment made in Indian country so that people in Indian country are as evenly represented in the world as anyone else. There's a cultural apartheid if you're still just making culturally specific work in a community. And that's why I did a film like Resbom, which was just a love story thriller. It's not pretending to be anything other than that, but it's something that people in the res could watch and be entertained by. And but this was a bit more in that cultural space, but I always feel it's like a foundational piece. I think it's part of why the novel's been so popular, because it takes people in, gives them a great understanding, almost like a cleansing in a way of cleansing away a level of ignorance in a lot of people. Also a sense, I think, in a lot of the natives that really love it, it's a sense of, I know there's a lot of pride over seeing just the sheer quality of talent on screen, and the sense of ownership, because, you know, this is a film that we all own that way creatively. And so I think that it's a bedrock. I think when a lot of people who don't know Indian country could walk away from this film and see another native film that's more out in a lot of different directions, and and there'll be a lot of touch points from a lot of things brought up in this. I think it's kind of good that way.
Yeah, the first time I ever heard about Wounded Knee was in a film with Val Kilmer.
Right.
I can't remember the name of it.
Thunderheart.
That's it. Mm-hmm. And that was my first kind of insight into kind of I presume it was a fictitious story.
Thunderheart was. It had a lot of roots in certain things that happened in the 70s there, but it was a fiction.
So this kind of came around full circle to actually obviously have gone out there with you and been kind of fortunate enough to see a little bit of the reservation.
I think the thing is that I felt, I've been in the room with, a lot of spectacular elders, and by that I mean just, some of the most exciting, charismatic, funny. There's this one guy I took Kent to meet when we went on a road trip. Kent and I actually did the road trip more or less as it is in the story, from Bemidji, Minnesota, and we actually parted company literally at Wounded Knee over a few days. And I took him in to meet this elder on Cheyenne River, the same reservation as Dave lives. And this guy's about 82. I hadn't met him in 12 years or whatever. But I wanted to see how Kent was in that space. So I phoned him up, and his opening line before I said a word was, FBI or CIA? And I just said, neither, I'm a movie producer. And he just laughed. And I said, can I come over? And he said, sure. As good as a stranger. But this guy's one of the most, I've met other people in Indian country from completely different areas who are like, oh yeah, I met, this guy is just somebody you'd never forget. He's such a wonderful human being. And we were over at his house, and we were just cracking jokes the whole time. But Kent is much more culturally aware than I am, and tries to do the right thing more. And so it was sort of interesting seeing him in the space compared to me. I'm just like slouching back in the chair, and just, as I say, we're just coming up with punchlines and zinging them back and forth. Whereas Kent's like, well, I'm here with an elder and I want to be respectful and whatever else. So it was very interesting seeing the different energy between us. And that sort of informed a lot on how the character was different. The important thing as well is, because I'm not American, being Scottish, I kind of see how white Americans are in Indian country, and it's incredibly different to Europeans. I guarantee you, people in Indian country, Lakota in South Dakota are way more cosmopolitan on average than your typical white South Dakotan. I've consistently found this. I once took a photographer from Paris down to the reservation for a couple of days, and we just spent a week traveling the Black Hills with, we were hanging out with the governor of South Dakota and a lot of the politicians. And a lot of the time they could barely tell you what was going on in Montana. And then I took him to meet some people in the res that I knew. We were with one woman chatting away, and she said, oh, what magazine do you shoot for in Paris? And he said the magazine, and she said, yeah, but they're only good for the photos. The articles are rubbish. And, he's amazed because, she knows the quality of literature in Paris. In her garden, she has a Mongolian yurt that she'd taken back from a trip she made to Mongolia and had been all over the world. And most of the people he met had friends from Germany or whatever else, so quite a lot. He was meeting more people who had been to Europe, but also a lot who had far more European friends. Everyone I know on the reservation has some friend from somewhere in Europe, pretty much. So it's kind of an interesting thing. So I go and have the most wonderful, wonderful time on the reservation. And it was key that I could see it from that dance from a different perspective.
Both Nerburn's.
Yeah. So I was an outsider in both worlds. And so I wasn't looking at it from more of a Nerburn perspective. In some respects, I related to his perspective a little bit less in some ways. And that's what kept it interesting.
So can you tell us a little bit about your history with that particular area of the land, the Lakota people?
Well, I first went out in the summer of '99, and it was interesting because it started in part with, I'd just been watching a documentary about Wovoka, the Paiute prophet who created a ghost dance religion of 1890 that swept across America and led to ultimately the killing of Sitting Bull and the Wounded Knee Massacre as a sort of consequence of the white government's reaction. And I started developing a screenplay partly based on that. I became fascinated with the travesty of Wounded Knee and whatnot. And then I remember stumbling on Russell Means' autobiography, American Indian Movement Leader. I was aware of him through reading about Brando, just in my interest in film. And his autobiography blew me away, filled me in a lot more about the politics of Pine Ridge, the Reign of Terror, Wounded Knee Occupation 73, and all those sorts of things. And then, lo and behold, I'm watching the news one day, and I see that there's a ghost shirt taken from the Wounded Knee Massacre that had been sitting in a museum in Glasgow, Scotland from 1891. Delegation of Lakota came over, asked for it back, and the Scottish government and Scottish people said yes, in spite of the museum wanting to cling on to it, as museums are prone to. And it was that summer it was going to be returned. So I knew I was going to go out, and I went out there a bit early. And, you know, I'd taken an overnight bus from Scotland to London, flight to Chicago, and then about a 20-hour drive, or 15 hours, or I don't know how long it took, but it was a crazy long drive across from Chicago. It was about 1,000 miles or something. And I'm driving into Pine Ridge, dazed and confused. What am I doing here? Da da da. And I went to Wounded Knee. This local guy showed me around, and then he directed me to. He thought it might be interesting for me to go to this Camp Justice, which is a protest camp on the border next to Whiteclay, this liquor town, this illegal liquor town, just off the reservation, for a couple of murders that had just taken place. It was what they were protesting about. So I went there, walked in there. It was quite intimidating. It was a searing hot day, and I have no idea where I am and anything. But people were very friendly, and they said, well, the person you should speak to is Tom Poorbear. He's going to be here in half an hour, but he's just coming to take us up to Russell Means' house. I'm like, this is amazing. So he came along, and I went with them up to Russell's house. And then Russell asked if I wanted to film 3 days of political meetings that were happening there. I was like, of course. And so that was my first 3 hours on the res. I was, found myself at Russell's house, this hero of mine, being asked to film these meetings. And it just all came from there. It was extraordinary. It was just one of those things, just meant to be. And that filming, culminated in The Thunder Being Nation, which was a documentary I shot and edited on and off over 13 years. So sort of such an epic project. And then, and also, everything I've done there has had a different purpose. Razbom, I wanted to do a film that was just a movie, to be entertaining in Indian country. A Thunder Being Nation was sort of an obligation to people there who'd asked me to document what was going on and cover a lot of things, and kept asking me back. And then I sort of became very conscious of the fact that, the documentary was very hard-hitting. I wasn't finding things that celebrated Indian country enough. Nobody else, everyone was making the serious documentaries. And so I did a TV show which was called The Hub, which was the first show made for First Nations Experience, the first 24/7 native channel in the US. And it was 13.5-hour episodes going around the States and Canada, meeting the most incredible, fun, dynamic, talented people you could meet. And we've such a wide representation of tribes. And it was partly that thing of a reaction to, I'm very conscious of the fact that Pine Ridge and Lakota is very much a focus of a lot of work. A lot of people else in Indian country go, what about us? And so we had a huge array of tribes represented in different regions, and just some of the most extraordinarily talented people. And it's a real celebration of Indian country. And then Neither Wolf Nor Dog comes in as a very, very different space in terms of energy, in terms of age of characters. It's sort of an elders piece. And I think that's crucial. That the only other key Indian country project I've got, which I'd like to do, is a very exciting action-adventure show. And it's something very heroic and whatnot, and it just fills a space that nobody's ever done touching upon Indian country. And it's all, it's like anything. It needs to be treated like a world, not a narrow perspective. And so, it's about balancing it out.
So Thunder Being Nation, you'd obviously done quite a lot of groundwork there. I mean, I've seen it, and it kind of really opened up my understanding of what had happened in South Dakota on Pine Ridge Reservation, and the kind of brushes with the FBI, and a lot of the kind of tension between the kind of federal government, this kind of like sort of, how would one say it, this invading race almost coming in and kicking off kind of like the people who had been there for thousands of years and learned to live in the land. I presume all of that really kind of gave you a good stead into kind of like understanding.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things is, even more than what's in the documentary, is what was behind the documentary. I could have filmed a far more dramatic documentary by covering things that happened when I was in the room that was inappropriate to film. There was a lot of things I was privy to that I would never, ever have filmed, just out of respect. But the other thing was that it was very clear for me at the beginning that the entire voice of A Thunder Being Nation is 100% a broad section of the community on Pine Ridge. I don't do that sort of typical thing of a process documentary on TV, which is bringing in external historians or experts to talk about somewhere that is not their land. And it's an odd thing that happens, and it seems to only happen with Indian country, where people make statements like, yeah, but it's not objective because it's ultimately a bunch of Lakota talking about the Lakota reality. And that to me is so desperately insulting. It's like, what, they need a white person to talk to validate anything? It's like saying that a documentary about Scotland wouldn't be valid unless it had some English people talking about Scottish history. It's totally absurd. But it's this weird trick that goes in off in people's heads, in part, I think, because they're just so used to natives being excluded from their own history, in terms of the telling of their own history. And it just shows how successful the obscenity of the American rewriting of history has been. That they're denied the telling of their own history.
I mean, the Black Hills is kind of a kind of an iconic sort of part of this kind of struggle that's going on, because I think the American government own it, don't they, at the moment?
Well, there's national park, and then there's mining interests there, and obviously a lot of private homes and whatever else, but it's not in, it was stolen from the Great Sioux Reservation as it's determined in, or Great Sioux Nation as it's determined in the treaties. That's all stolen land. And the Supreme Court in 1980 ruled that it was stolen, and instead of giving it back, they awarded a paltry compensation that the tribes, the combined tribes of Lakota, basically told them to take a running jump, and have never accepted the compensation.
I mean, it was like 100 million, wasn't it? Something like that.
Which for, there was one gold mine that in today's terms would be $60 billion worth of gold just from that one gold mine. And, and that with interest is now over $1 billion. And that's $1 billion being turned down by the poorest people in the United States. And by that, I'm using the Lakota Nation collectively. Pine Ridge has had a county in it that historically, decade after decade, through the censuses, had, pretty much the lowest standard of living, but occasionally, more recent years, one of the other reservations in South Dakota sometimes pips it. It's a hard thing to determine because the census figures are not very accurate there anyway. But
yeah, it's about principle, really, isn't it, for them?
Yeah, it's
well, for us, really.
Well, I mean, the thing is that justice should never be a question. We shouldn't be having to justify justice. We shouldn't have to justify. I mean, if you have a constitution, you have to uphold it, and it's sort of one of these things about the cherry picking of the Constitution. The Constitution, in Article 6, basically says the supreme treaties are the supreme law of the land, and that basically nothing the states do, nothing that Congress does can basically violate it, and yet they have completely violated pretty much every treaty. And so that's in complete violation of the Constitution. And so they like to fight for the First Amendment, Second Amendment, or whatever, but they never give a damn about the breach of treaties. And it's crazy that they never uphold the treaties' rights. And so the tribes have really been treated abysmally that way. So yeah.
Can you also, you're kind of quite a, I'm not going to say a one-man band, but you like kind of controlling and looking after a project in a very personal kind of way.
Well, everything should be, I think all art should be personal and honest, but it's really necessity is the mother of invention. I mean, I do everything on the film. This, with the exception of sound recording on location, I had nobody else involved in pre-production other than things like Zahn helping with the audition of Chris, and then during production, we had Rick Van Ness as the sound guy, who just was extraordinary, wonderful human being, and then we'd have invariably another person helping out just with various things, holding the boom or clapperboard, running around, that sort of thing. But everything else I was doing, other than our wonderful host, Theo Bryans, who looked after us brilliantly and fed us in the morning and at night. And I'd be running around, sometimes cooking first thing for lunch and leaving it in a slow cooker or whatever else. So I was doing everything, cinematography, creating props, even in the middle of filming, going, I need bacon fat right now, running into the RV and microwaving it to suddenly have some bacon fat for a scene, and, lighting the scenes, and, it was just sort of everything. And other than car mechanic, because the Buick kept breaking down, and the amount of time Chris Sweeney in particular, who's a great mechanic, and Rick Van Ness would spend repairing it, they spent a lot of time on it. But they figured it out. I mean, they really did some extraordinary things. And then, I got into post-production, and it was me the whole way through, all the way up to the way it's shown in cinemas, the color correction, the sound design. And I say necessity because nobody's rushing forward to throw money at these films, and so it's made for almost nothing. And I don't like asking favors. I like making sure people are paid, and so there's only little money to pay people, so I have to take care of everything else. And some ways it takes longer, but in a lot of ways you can work a lot faster because you're not having to sit down and have conferences with whole bunches of people. I mean, Chris and I drove out from LA. I mean, he did the driving, and we drove out in the red truck that's in the film, and it was about 1,200 miles, and we arrived on a Friday night, and we were filming the next Thursday, and pretty much everything was pulled together in that time on location, other than me driving out with props and things like that. And I would do things like, to save money, I would, in the long term, I put a lot of my own money into buying and selling equipment. I bought 3 vehicles for the film and then sold afterwards. I bought an RV, which was one of them, and I actually made money on it. So once you average it out between the cameras and the lenses and the Steadicams and lights and all those other things that I bought, I walked away more than covering my costs on it. So that doesn't even exist in the budget. It's one of the ways I managed to do it for so little, and make sure that the contributions made by all the people that supported us through Kickstarter, that their money was being used as fully as it could be, and it was never being wasted. Our hosts on the reservation were staggering. The film was really made possible by fans of the novel through Kickstarter, and which is actually stunning because it's such big fans of the novel. Everyone's so emotionally invested in the film, and to me, it's much bigger responsibility than just having investors, because it's a leap of faith, and there's so much trust involved that I could deliver. And since the film, we started previewing it, and we've had feedback from people who love the novel, and their response has been exceptional. And Kent's response is he's totally in love with the film, and it's really just the most beautiful feeling as one writer to another, or one interpreter of work to another, that the response he's had. Beautiful thing.